The story doesn't start in California. It starts with a man walking through the woods, kicking at leaves, thinking about anything but history. It's late autumn in the North Georgia hills. The air is damp, the ground is soft, and the forest is quiet in that heavy, watchful way that makes you feel like you're the one being observed. A hunter, call him Parks like in one of the old stories, pushes through the brush along a narrow deer trail. His boots slip on clay. He curses under his breath, stumbles, and his foot catches on something half buried in the dirt. He looks down, annoyed, and sees a rock, ugly, lumpy, streaked with mud. But the sun cuts through the trees at just the right angle. For half a second, the stone doesn't look brown. It looks yellow, not like the leaves, like metal. He bends down, picks it up, turns it in his hand. Now pause here. How many world-changing stories have started exactly like this? Someone tripping over something they were never supposed to notice. What if I told you that this moment on a forgotten hillside in Georgia would help rip thousands of people from their homes, send desperate men racing across oceans, and quietly feed the money machines of empires, and that almost no one remembers it? You've heard of the California gold rush, but this is the one that came first, on land that wasn't America's to sell, in a country that was still deciding who counted as human and who didn't. This is America's forgotten gold rush. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee what it says about us. Stay with me, because before the glitter of '49, there was a quieter fever building in the hills of North Georgia, and in the boardrooms and government offices that watch those hills with hungry eyes. The thing about gold is that it doesn't shout at first. It whispers, a rumor here, a farmer there who suddenly buys more land than he ever should have been able to afford, a blacksmith's wife overhearing talk of Yellowstones, heavier than they should be, a newspaper editor in a small Georgia town getting a letter he doesn't quite believe, then printing it anyway, because what if? The first reports sound almost embarrassed. Gold, they say, has been found in our mountains. They don't yet call it a rush. They call it excitement, stir, movement. There's always this polite distance, as if no one wants to admit how badly they want it to be true. And then suddenly, the distance disappears. Because when one man finds a nugget in a creek bed, the neighbors come. When the neighbors come, they bring their cousins. And when their cousins hear that someone, somewhere, found a piece of metal worth more than everything they own, they don't ask for proof. They pack. Imagine what that moment would feel like for you. You're a poor farmer. The soil's thin, the debts are thick, and every bad harvest feels like a sentence. Then word reaches your town. They are finding gold in the hills, real gold. Men are leaving their plows in the field and coming back with pockets filled. Do you laugh it off? Or do you lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if you're the idiot for staying put? How many bad days would it take for you to say, "Fine, I'm going"? Within months, streams and ridges that barely had names explode with life. Rough shacks, tents, fires that burn all night, hammers ringing on stone, men scrambling in creeks, pants rolled up, sleeves pinned, eyes locked on the bottom of the pan, as if staring hard enough can change the shape of reality. It looks chaotic. It looks primitive. But under that noise, something very organized is happening. Money is moving. Merchants arrive almost as fast as miners. Prices triple. A pan that cost cents now costs dollars. A pair of boots becomes a small investment. Whiskey becomes a tax on hope. And watching all of this from just far enough away to keep their hands clean are men in coats and offices who understand something the prospectors don't. Gold in a hill isn't just a personal dream. It's leverage. The land where this frenzy erupts is not empty. It belongs, by treaty, by memory, by every moral measure, to the Cherokee. The people whose paths crossed these rivers long before any surveyor sharpened a pencil. Now picture being Cherokee in these years. You wake up and the woods you hunted in as a child are suddenly full of strangers. They trample through your fields, cut your trees, camp by your water. They don't ask. They don't apologize. They talk loudly about claims and rights, as if the land is already theirs. At first, maybe you think they'll pass. The fever will break. It always does. But it doesn't. Because gold has this one cruel habit. It turns temporary into permanent. What starts as canvas tents turns into wooden buildings. What starts as a footpath turns into a road. What starts as, we're just here for the season, turns into, my family will be here long after you're gone. And in the background, in state capitals and in Washington, the logic is forming. If there is wealth in that land, can we really leave it to them? That's the question behind so many polite speeches and pieces of paper. You can almost hear it echoing down the years. Can we really leave it to them? Hold that thought. Because while the hills grow crowded, something else is spreading too. Stories. A letter from a miner reaches a cousin in New York. He exaggerates his success because nobody writes home to say, I'm cold and broken sick. There's always that one line, a few more weeks and I'll be set for life. The cousin reads it by candlelight, shows it to his friends. One of them has a brother in Liverpool. He copies parts of the letter, changes names, makes it sound even more promising. Soon there are whispers in taverns in European port cities. America is pouring gold out of its mountains. Do you see how quickly this stops being local? Within a few seasons, the hills of Georgia are tied by rumor and opportunity to a web of ports, banks, and insurance houses stretching across the Atlantic. Where there is gold, there is credit. Where there is credit, there is risk. Where there is risk, there is someone ready to sell you safety. At a price. Maybe you're sitting in London hearing all this. You're not going to dig in a river yourself, but you might finance a company that will. You might speculate on American land. You might back a shipping line that carries Southern cotton and quietly shipments of newly minted coins. It's easy to say, this is just a regional story. It isn't. The men freezing in muddy camps might think they're chasing a personal dream, but the metal they pry from the earth doesn't stop at the edge of the forest. It flows into a growing American economy and then into a world where banks, empires, and war machines all run on gold. And the rush itself transforms into something bigger, a template, the pattern that we will see again in California, and Colorado, and the Klondike, and the oil fields, and the lithium belts. Remote land, a whisper of untapped wealth, a flood of desperate people, and behind them, quieter, more patient, more dangerous, the institutions that know how to turn chaos into power. Here's the part we don't like to admit. Most of the people who came to those hills did not get rich. Some broke, even. Many lost everything. Some died nameless, buried in shallow graves, their families never learning they weren't just running late. The winners were often the merchants, the land speculators, the banks, the officials who turned gold into influence. You can feel the unfairness in your bones, can't you? But here's the twist. Even the losers helped to build something. Every road cut into the hills for wagons. Every rough bridge thrown across a creek. Every supply line from the coast. These didn't vanish when the surface gold thinned out. They stayed. They made the next rush easier. They taught the next generation of prospectors where to look, what tools to use, how to organize, who to follow. And when decades later someone shouted gold in California, do you think it was a coincidence that experienced miners from Georgia showed up, already knowing how to dig a dream out of river gravel? The forgotten rush didn't die. It migrated. It turned into a human network, a chain of knowledge, techniques, and mythology that stretched westward and then outward, linking the hills of Georgia to the mountains of California, the diggings in Australia, and the vaults of banks thousands of miles away. Imagine being one of those early Georgia miners, years later, standing waist-deep in freezing Sierra water. You're older, bones harder, eyes sharper. You've seen this movie before. And you know one thing the greenhorns around you don't. Most of them won't find what they're looking for. But something else will. Power will. Before we go deeper, before we talk about the people whose lives were uprooted so this gold could move, and how this local rush became part of a global machine, do one thing for me. If stories like this, messy, uncomfortable, but true, matter to you, lock in. Follow this story all the way to the end. Because what happened in those forgotten hills isn't just about the past. It's a mirror. And the next time the world whispers rush around some new resource, you'll recognize the pattern when you see it. There's a moment in every rush when the dream stops being shiny. It doesn't happen with a gunfight or a dramatic speech. It happens at 4 a.m., when the fire has burned low and the man sharing your shack is coughing so hard he can't lie flat. It happens when you stare into the pan for the 100th time that day and see nothing but sand and your own tired reflection. On paper, this is the age of opportunity. In the stories, it's all strike it rich and new beginnings. In reality, it smells like sweat, smoke, and mud that never quite dries. Imagine waking up in a camp thrown together along a creek. The ground is uneven. Your back hurts from yesterday's digging. You pull on damp boots because they never fully dried from the river. Breakfast is a piece of hard bread, maybe a strip of meat if last night was good. You step outside and you're not alone. The hillside is alive with men, shovels biting into earth, picks cracking rock, pans swooshing water in the same hypnotic rhythm. Voices carry, curses, jokes, rumors of a new big find, 2 ridges over. Your whole existence has narrowed to a simple equation. What comes out of the ground today decides if I eat well next week. How long before that equation starts to break you? Now zoom out, because while you fight the mud, something bigger is happening in the background, something you can feel but not name. You've noticed the land around you isn't empty. There are cabins further up the ridge that were there long before your shack, paths that feel older than your language. You see families watching from a distance, Cherokee faces, quiet, measuring. At first, maybe there's some trade. Maybe you pay for food, for guidance through the woods. Maybe you share a fire, awkwardly, with someone whose grandfather is buried on the hill you're now tearing open. But as more miners arrive, the balance slips. Newcomers don't come with open hands, they come with paper, claims, deeds. Laws passed in faraway rooms that say this land is now open for lottery, for seizure, for distribution, to citizens who weren't here when the first trees fell. If you're Cherokee, imagine watching strangers line up to draw numbered lots for pieces of your homeland, like raffle tickets for your memories. Does it feel like a law or a robbery with extra steps? Here's the ugly truth. The gold under Cherokee land made it easier to pretend that removal was inevitable. Powerful men pointed at the hills and said, "Look at all that wealth going unused." They didn't see centuries of stewardship, stories, graves. They saw a ledger with the wrong name on it. And when a government wants what you stand on more than it wants you, history starts to bend in one direction. You know how this part ends, even if you've never connected the dots. Treaties broken, promises shredded, the solutions scribbled on maps by people who have never walked the ground they're erasing. Families forced into lines, soldiers at their flanks, a march west that will be remembered as the Trail of Tears. Now ask yourself, if the hills had been worthless rock, no whisper of gold, would those families have been forced out in the same way, at the same speed? When we say America's forgotten gold rush, this is what we're really talking about. Not just men in muddy boots, but the price paid by people who never sifted a single pan. And yet, if you stood in one of those camps and asked a miner why he was there, most wouldn't mention politics or removal or law. They'd say something painfully small and human. I'm trying to give my family a better life. That's the twist that makes this so hard to look at clearly. The same desperation that drives a man to leave his farm and dig until his hands bleed is the desperation that powerful people manipulate to justify taking land. We must open it up, they say, presenting theft as fairness, greed as destiny. How many times has that story repeated since? Here's another layer we don't love talking about. Look closer at those mines. You'll see faces that don't match the mythology of free men with shovels. You see enslaved men forced into tunnels, breathing dust, carrying ore for someone else's fortune. You see enslaved women working the water wheels and sluices, their labor turning rock into money they will never touch. Their names rarely appear in the letters home about striking it rich. But the gold does not move without them. So let's be brutally honest. This opportunity rush was also a machine that fed on bodies. Enslaved labor, cheap labor, disposable labor. The dream at the top was always balanced on a nightmare at the bottom. How do you build a fair society on that foundation? And if we still live with the echoes of that question today, what does that say about how much of this we've actually dealt with? If this is hitting you in the gut, don't look away. Because understanding the human cost is the only way to see the next part for what it really is. Not a happy ending, but a transformation. Because even after the easy gold fades, the story doesn't. The rush doesn't just stop, it hardens. When the first veins are exhausted and the creek beds have been scraped clean, the camps thin out. Some miners, too stubborn or too broke to leave, dig deeper shafts, risking cave-ins and suffocating air. Others sell their tools for whatever they can get, curse the hills and vanish. But what they've built, roads hacked through the forest, crude bridges, supply trails, half-finished buildings, those stay. Gold rushes are like wildfires that clear a space, and what grows afterward is never the same forest. In the hills, rough tracks become established roads. Wagons replace mules. Towns that started as shanty clusters get names, post offices, churches, schools. The chaos of the camp calcifies into something like permanence. Look at a map decades later and you'll see dots. Towns that trace their origin back to this fever. Settlements born because someone found a yellow stone nearby. And the government takes note. There is now enough gold moving out of these hills that Washington decides it needs a closer grip on the flow. A new branch mint is established, closer to the source, stamping the federal eagle onto coins born in what used to be Cherokee ground. That coin in a banker's hand in New York, it shimmers with a story it will never tell. Think about that the next time you see an old gold coin framed in a museum. It isn't just metal, it's compressed history, tunnels, dispossession, riverbeds, ledgers, names lost. Here's where the story shifts again. The hills that once felt like the edge of the world are now plugged into a growing national nervous system. Messages move faster, goods move faster, people move faster. And once you've built a pathway for one rush, you've quietly laid the tracks for the next one. So when word breaks, years later, that gold has been found in California, who do you think is ready? Not the city clerk who reads about it in a polite Eastern newspaper. The men who've already lived this once. Experienced miners from Georgia, the Carolinas, and other early fields hear the whispers and feel a chill of recognition. They know the smell of fresh hype, the sound of lies in a saloon, the feel of a claim worth fighting for. They also know something the green newcomers don't. This story rarely ends the way you think. Still, many of them go, because once you've tasted that cocktail of risk and hope, it's hard to go back to quiet farming life. You're chasing more than metal now. You're chasing the version of yourself you almost became the first time, the one who did strike it rich. Can you blame them? This is where our forgotten rush spreads its DNA across a continent. Techniques born in these early southern diggings, how to read a river, how to build a sluice, how to form a mining partnership, how to organize a camp, get carried west. Place names even repeat. Little echoes of old camps reappear in new regions, like ghosts of a first fever. The hills in Georgia taught a generation how to chase a dream in the ground. California, Colorado, the Klondike, Australia, they're bigger stages, louder stories. But behind the spectacle, you can see the same choreography, the same hungry institutions waiting just off stage. Banks, railroad companies, merchants, lawyers, governments weighing how much land they're willing to seize, how many treaties they're willing to break this time. If you start to feel like none of this was accidental, that the pattern itself is the point, that's not paranoia. That's you finally seeing the system. Because while individuals think in terms of my chance, the system thinks in terms of our leverage. Roads, ports, branchments, telegraph lines, police forces, land offices. All of these grow stronger with every rush, every boom, every temporary camp that becomes a permanent town. Ask yourself a simple question. Who is better off when the dust settles? The average miner who staked everything on a rumor, or the institutions that now own the roads, the land titles, the shipping routes, the debt? If your answer makes you uneasy, good. We're not telling this story to make you nostalgic. We're telling it so you can recognize in your own time when a new opportunity is just an old pattern in a fresh costume. Because we haven't stopped doing this. We've just swapped gold for oil, or lithium, or real estate, or data, and we still tell ourselves the same comforting story, that the ones who want it more, who are willing to risk everything, deserve what they get, good or bad. But the hills of that forgotten rush whisper a different truth, that the game is often rigged long before the first shovel hits the ground. If you're still here, listening, you're already doing something rare. You're refusing to accept the postcard version of history. You're looking at the infrastructure beneath the myth, the roads, the laws, the coins, the bodies, that turned a local scramble in Georgia into a piece of a global system. Keep that mindset, because in the final stretch of this story, we're going to walk through the ruins in the museums, sift through the papers and the artifacts, and ask one last uncomfortable question. If a whole era could be built and whitewashed on the back of a forgotten gold rush, what else have we buried in the archives waiting to be found? Stay with this. Once you've trained your eye to see the tracks this rush left behind, you'll start spotting them everywhere. If you go there today, it doesn't look like the kind of place that could have rearranged lives across a continent. It looks quaint, a quiet town square, brick buildings with carefully preserved facades, a museum in an old courthouse, a gift shop selling tiny vials of gold and novelty pans. The kind of place you might drive through on a Sunday road trip, stop for ice cream, take a few photos, and keep going. If you didn't know, you'd miss it. But stand still for a moment. Don't look at the souvenir coins. Look at the floorboards, the foundation, the walls built from bricks fired in a time when the air was thick with dust and argument. This is what a forgotten gold rush looks like after you've sanded off the rough edges. Inside the museum, you might see the tools, heavy pans, rusted picks, chunks of ore under glass. There might be a map with colored pins showing where major strikes were found. Maybe even a recreated mine tunnel, dimly lit, sanitized, safe. But the most dangerous artifacts aren't the tools, they're the papers. Old land lottery tickets, crisp and yellowed, deeds transferring parcels from state to citizens, government notices explaining how vacant land will be allocated, mint records tracking shipments of gold turned into coin. Read them slowly and you feel a chill, the calm, bureaucratic language used to describe something that, on the ground, looked and felt like upheaval. This is how power hides itself, in ink and signatures and stamps. Ask yourself, how many times in history has something violent, chaotic, and immoral been converted into a neat piece of paperwork that looks perfectly reasonable if you squint? And how often do we, decades later, treat that paperwork as neutral evidence, forgetting that it was the last chapter in someone else's nightmare? Walk a little further and you might find display cases with newspaper clippings, headlines full of excitement. Rich finds, fortunes made. Buried in the smaller print are words like dispute, removal, tensions. The hierarchy of type tells you exactly what the public was supposed to care about. You've seen this pattern before, just with different fonts. Boom. Conflict, concern, repeat. Here's a brutal question. Why do you think this rush, with all its drama and impact, didn't become the central legend in America's story about itself? Why did California get the spotlight? Part of it is timing and scale. California was bigger, louder, more visually dramatic. Ships abandoned in harbors, cities exploding in size, international migration on a massive scale. But part of it is something else. California fits more comfortably into the myth Americans like. Brave men striking out for the frontier, facing wilderness, building something from nothing. Georgia doesn't. Georgia forces you to deal with slavery, native dispossession, and state-level defiance of federal law. It forces you to admit that extractive capitalism and ethnic cleansing were not unfortunate side notes. They were woven together. Is it any wonder the camera panned west? Ask yourself honestly, if you were building a national myth, which story would you put on the poster? The one where the land was empty until you arrived? Or the one where you arrived, found wealth, and then pushed the people already there off the map? We remember what's comfortable. We forget what is not, unless someone insists on digging it up again. That's what you're doing right now, digging. Not in river gravel, but in memory. You're panning through the silt of the past, trying to catch the heavy pieces that sank out of sight. And once you develop that skill, you can't confine it to one era. Because once you walk out of that little town, that museum, that hillside, the present hits you in the face. Listen carefully to how we talk about new booms. An oil field is discovered, a lithium deposit under some desert. A remote region opened up for logging or mining or drilling. Investors circle. Governments issue statements. Reporters arrive with drones and sound bites. The words change. The vibe doesn't. Untapped, underdeveloped, full of potential. Do you feel how eerily close that is to unclaimed, unused, vacant? And underneath the glossy announcements, you will always find the same questions, whispered or ignored. Who lives there now? Who will pay the environmental cost? Who will actually benefit when the dust settles? If the answers make you uncomfortable, congratulations. You're seeing the shape of the pattern. Think about communities today who wake up to find surveyors on their land, trucks rolling in, land values suddenly reassessed. Think about how their pain gets translated eventually into polite documents and memos and legislation that make it all look inevitable. Tell me that doesn't feel familiar? It should, because the logic of that forgotten gold rush never really went away. It just changed outfits. Now, before you shrug and say, that's just how the world works, pause. Who taught you to think that way? Who benefits when you treat these things as natural instead of designed? Every generation is handed a story about how wealth is created and who deserves it. In the 1800s, the story went like this. If you're brave enough to head into the wilderness and tough enough to stay, you've earned whatever you find. The fact that the wilderness was someone else's home, or that your courage depends on borrowed guns and laws bent in your favor, that part gets edited out. Today, the script sounds more like, if you're smart enough to innovate, fast enough to invest, flexible enough to move where the opportunities are, you deserve the upside. And again, the fact that your innovation might depend on underpaid labor or your investment relies on laws that let corporations outrun accountability, or your flexibility is built on someone else's forced displacement, quietly written in small letters at the bottom. History isn't just names and dates, it's the operating system running in the background of our lives. The forgotten gold rush is like an old line of code that nobody ever deleted. New programs run on top of it, but the logic is the same. Find some place out of sight of the powerful center. Declare its resources underused. Flood it with desperate people chasing a dream. Let chaos do the dirty work. Step in once the dust clears and formalize the new order with papers and laws. Rinse, repeat. So what do you do with that? You can't go back in time and put the gold back in the hills or rewrite the treaties. You can't unmarch the Trail of Tears. But you can refuse to let the story stay buried. You can change what counts as forgotten. Because forgetting is never neutral. It's an act, a choice. When we forget, we make room for the same trick to be played again in a new place, on a new community, with a new resource. When we remember, we mess with the script. The next time someone comes to you with a shiny new rush, an investment, a boomtown, a rare opportunity, you can ask harder questions. Who was here before? Who's paying the invisible bill? Who wrote the rules for this game? And when? And maybe, just maybe, you decide not to be the person chasing rumors in the mud while someone else quietly builds roads and banks around you. Maybe you decide you're more interested in understanding the system than gambling inside it. Maybe you decide your role in the story is not to be a prospector, but an archivist, a witness, a disruptor. The one who says, wait, we've seen this before, when everyone else is too dazzled by gold dust to think straight. That's what this channel is trying to do. We're not here to give you comforting nostalgia or to dress history up as a theme park attraction where everyone learns a lesson and goes home. We're here to follow the money, the power, and the myths, to walk into stories that got pushed to the edges, the Georgias behind the Californias, and drag them back to the center. Because when you put enough of those forgotten pieces together, you stop seeing random events and start seeing patterns. And once you see patterns, you're harder to manipulate. If you've made it this far, it means something about you. Most people bail out when a story gets messy, when it stops flattering the hero, when the bad guys don't look like movie villains but like systems and signatures. You didn't. So here's the deal I'll offer you. If you want more stories like this, the ones that peel back the pretty front cover of history and force us to look at the binding, stick around. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this bigger investigation. Drop a comment and tell me this. What other gold rushes do you want us to dissect next? The oil boom that made and broke empires? The banking panics that nearly collapsed the American financial system? The land grabs that reshaped entire regions? Your suggestion might become the next episode where we take another cherished myth, turn it over in our hands like that first Yellowstone, and ask, what are we not being told? Because the hills of North Georgia aren't just a quaint backdrop, they're a warning. They remind us that you can build a whole national story on top of something and then decide collectively not to talk about how it began. They remind us that coins in a display case can be polished, but the history behind them never really gets clean. And they remind us that every time the world whispers, there's gold in those hills, literal or metaphorical, there are always two stories running at once. The one about individuals chasing a dream, and the one about systems rearranging the world. The first one is loud, the second one is quiet. Golden History USA exists to turn up the volume on the quiet story. So the next time you hear about a rush, new mines, new tech, new fortunes, remember the forgotten one. Remember the hills, the papers, the families, the roads. Remember the pattern, and ask yourself with clear eyes, in this new rush, am I the miner, the merchant, the one being moved, or the one who finally refuses to play the old game on somebody else's terms? History won't answer that for you, but it will give you the tools to see what's really going on when the ground starts glittering again.